Closing the Loop, Episode 3: Why Horses Become Safe Spaces for Broken Humans, and Why Your Horse is Not Your Therapist. Welcome back to Closing the Loop. I'm really grateful that you're here with me. In a previous episode, I shared a much deeper part of my story about losing the original Olympic dream with Vesper and the identity collapse that followed. We looked at how sometimes the things that appear to destroy our lives are not actually destroying our future, but exposing the parts of ourselves that were either built on old survival mechanisms, unresolved wounds, and identities that helped us survive but may no longer help us thrive. And also, what parts of us do we need to strengthen to be able to carry this new reality? So today I want to explore something that sits at the heart of so many horse-human relationships, and something I believe many lifelong horse people understand intuitively long before we even have words for it. And that is, why do horses become safe spaces for broken humans? You know, you might have asked yourself these questions like, why do so many of us find our way to the stable when life gets overwhelming? Or, why at the specific difficult time of our life did we find horses? Or why are horses so good in equine assisted therapy to help us look at our own stuff? Why does just standing beside a horse sometimes feels easier than sitting across from another human? And why do so many people who've experienced emotional pain and trauma and rejection and even loneliness describe horses as the beings that saved them? Now, I think there are many, many reasons. Firstly, horses are honest. For those of us who grew up around unpredictable people, maybe you had some inconsistency in your family unit, maybe even emotional manipulation, or some environments where we were constantly guessing what someone else was thinking or feeling. That type of honesty that horses can offer us, it becomes incredibly regulating. Horses don't smile while secretly resenting you. They don't tell you that everything is okay, or even better, fine, and then punishing you emotionally later. They don't manipulate their communication to protect an image of themselves. If a horse is worried, they show worry. If a horse feels regulated, they soften. If something changes in their environment, they respond to it. That's why there's such an incredible freedom in interacting with a being who communicates with us about what's actually happening rather than what they want you to believe is happening. We can tell ourselves fake it till you make it. Horses don't really have that. And then for people who grew up consistently, scanning the room and trying to figure out what needs to meet before they're being asked for, if ever, horses can feel like the first relationship where we can finally stop guessing. Also, horses live in the present moment. Many of us are carrying those emotional wounds, and we spend a lot of time outside of being present. So we may replay the past or prepare for the future or scan for danger or predict what might happen. Because at some point our nervous system learned that anticipation was the best form of protection. Now, horses, they constantly invite us back into the now. They don't really care who we were yesterday. They don't really care about the mistakes that we made 5 years ago. They rarely hold anything against us that we've done to them. If you regulate yourself and begin to treat them fairly. They're only really interested in who is standing right in front of them. So this kind of presence can be incredibly healing for us because it gives us a moment where we are not what happened to us. We're just here. You know, horses have this incredible power to offer connection without demanding an explanation. You know, many people who've been through difficult experiences, they get tired of having to explain themselves all the time. You know, there always has to be a reason or justification. So we can get tired of trying to find words for things that sometimes, you know, happened before we even had language. Like, how can we put words to that? We can get really tired of defending how we feel the way that we feel. And no, we don't owe an explanation to anyone about anything. However, if you want to lead, whether it's you're, you know, leading yourself, leading your relationships, leading your horse, you do have to explain things. But all in all, horses don't really ask for the whole story. They just respond to the state that we're in. They don't need a detailed explanation of why the nervous system feels overwhelmed today. They simply notice where you are and then respond honestly to that. Are you able to make them feel safe? And for many people, that is the first time they experience acceptance without needing to justify their existence. You know, horses, they really allow us to feel powerful without needing to overpower the other. And this can be incredibly important, especially for people who felt powerless in their lives, you know, victimized people. Feeling powerful without needing to play power games, that is the game. So when you build a relationship with a 600-kilogram horse, and that relationship is based on trust and communication and mutual respect, something inside us, it can change. They offer so much presence, but no manipulation. And that can help us really realize that leadership doesn't have to mean domination, because let's face it, 600 kilos, you know, 1,200 pounds, you're not going to control that by force. Strength doesn't come from force. You can influence another being through calmness and clarity and connection. And for someone who has experienced unhealthy expressions of power, that lesson can rewrite something very, very deep. And of course, we've talked a lot about horses mirroring us, being mirrors for us. You know, they reflect the things that we sometimes can't yet see in ourselves. They can show us our tension and our fear, our inconsistency, lack of boundaries, but also positive things like softness and kind leadership and courage and growth. And of course, they don't judge us, they just respond. And that kind of honesty, you know, it's one of the greatest gifts that horses can give us. But this is where I feel like we need to start maturing this conversation, because while I truly believe that horses can create some of the safest and most healing relationships that we'll ever experience, and that's certainly what's happened to me, there's an important distinction that took me many, many years to understand. That a horse can be part of our healing, but the horse is not responsible for our healing. The horse is not our therapist. And I know that may sound strange coming from someone whose entire life has been shaped by the healing power of horses. If you've listened to a um, previous episode or two, you know this. You know, your horse is not your therapist. And I want to be really clear about what I mean by that, because I absolutely believe and have experienced that horses can be profoundly healing. You know, my experience was that when I was a little girl, my very first safe space was not a person or a room or a place. It was a horse, a beautiful Finnish draft horse called Donut, who gave a frightened, terrified little girl an experience of peace and connection and emotional safety within 12 hours of being chased by grown men trying to take the only thing that I really owned at that time, which was my innocence. So yes, that moment shaped the entire direction of my life. Because horses for me became the place where I could breathe, where I didn't have to perform or explain myself or constantly monitor someone else's emotional state. Horses became those beings that I felt safest with because their communication was honest. They didn't pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. They didn't say one thing and mean another. They just responded to how they were regulated and how they were existing in their truth. And for a child who grew up around narcissistic dynamics, unpredictability, and emotional insecurity, that type of honesty was incredibly regulating. Incredibly regulating. Horses offered my nervous system something that I desperately needed at that time. And that was congruence. This equals this. And that never changed. Didn't have to guess. But there's that very important distinction that took me so long to realize, that there's a difference between a horse providing a healing relationship and making the horse responsible for healing us. And when horses provide a healing relationship for us, that creates connection. And when we make the horse responsible for healing us, that creates a burden. This is where I think that we need some more nuanced conversation in the horse world, because many of us didn't arrive at horses as completely regulated, emotionally integrated human beings. A lot of us arrived with our stories, our wounds, our fears, or some coping mechanisms or unmet needs. And for many people, horses were the very first beings that made them feel truly seen, accepted, or safe. And there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that. In fact, I think that is beautiful, to be able to feel seen, to be able to feel accepted, to be able to feel safe. What a gift that is. But then emotional maturity eventually asks us to look at the relationship from both sides. I think we can agree that our horses are not just characters in our healing story. They're living, breathing, emotionally intelligent beings having their own experience of our relationship as well. So I had to learn this lesson myself in a very, very painful way after Vesper's injury. When her competition career ended, I genuinely believed that the depth of my suffering was evidence of how much I loved her, how much I had believed in her. I thought that the guilt and the responsibility and the endless replaying of everything I could have done, differently, as if there was anything like that I could have done. But all of that replaying in my mind meant that I care about this horse, that obsession meant that I cared somehow. But years later, I can see something that's very, very different from that. Vesper wasn't stuck in the story. I was. She healed her injury. Yes, it ended her career, but she didn't care about her career. She just adapted to her new life. She wasn't waking up every morning thinking about the competitions that she'd no longer attend or the dreams that had disappeared. She wasn't carrying that Olympic identity. She was being her wonderful self, a horse, a friend, comrade. But was I being a good comrade? You see, I was the one who couldn't let go because I attached meaning to her experience that actually belonged to me. And that was incredibly confronting to recognize because I had to acknowledge that what I thought was empathy was actually partly projection. I wasn't only feeling with her, I was putting my own unresolved pain and guilt and fear into her situation because my nervous system was interpreting her injury through my old wound patterning. And I had to ask myself a question that completely changed my horsemanship and how I viewed these relationships with horses. And that question was, am I actually listening to my horse, or am I listening to the story I have created about my horse? Because those two things, they can look very similar from the outside. But many horse people are deeply compassionate human beings. So a lot of people can relate to this. Doesn't make it right. That compassion is so beautiful. But compassion without self-awareness can become very, very confusing, especially for our horses. We can start believing that we're advocating for the horse when sometimes we're actually protecting a wounded part of ourselves. See if any of these hit home, because some of them really affected me when I got these realizations. 1, we might believe a horse feels rejected because we have a rejection wound. So if a horse is rejected by, say, a paddock mate, we might feel bad for the horse, even though the horse might not feel the rejection at all. What about this one? We might believe that horses can't cope with boundaries because boundaries were painful for us when we were growing up. Like, I don't want to set boundaries because how I was set boundaries against was so painful. I don't want my horse to ever feel as bad as I felt. Nothing to do with the horse, just me. What about this one? We might believe every moment of discomfort is harmful because we have not yet developed a healthy relationship with our own discomfort. And of course, the fact of the matter is that if there's no discomfort, there's no growth. So you see, I don't know if you see, but I see a lot of people who are using a lot of human emotional projections on horses and then treat the horses not as horses, but as extensions of themselves. And I think that's very narcissistic. How about this one? We might avoid asking anything of the horse because somewhere inside of us, we're still trying to prove that we are kind, safe, or different from the people who hurt us. So we don't want to be the villain. And in the meantime, our horse is emotionally dysregulated because we're not creating a container for them to safely exist in. Please understand, and I say this with enormous compassion because I've lived it. I know what it feels like to love horses so much that you never want to cause them any distress. I know what it feels like to want to protect them from every negative experience because you know what it feels like uh, to not be protected yourself. That was me for years because I felt like Donut had protected me from being assaulted. So I always wanted to protect horses from what I considered being assaulted. And that could be as simple as, you know, setting a boundary with a horse that's out of control or avoiding asking for anything because we don't want to be the villain. That was in our story, not theirs. But horses don't need us to project our wounds onto them. What they need from us is for us to heal our wounds so that we can see them clearly and be present with them. If we don't do our own inner work, we risk asking horses to carry things that were never theirs to carry. And many of us experienced that as children. We had to grow up way too early. We were asked to carry things that were not ours to carry. And if we don't do our own inner work, that's exactly how we're passing on the pain to other people, in this case, horses. And one of the greatest shifts in my relationship with horses happened when I stopped asking, does this horse make me feel safe? Or is this horse doing a good job? Or, is this a good horse? And I started asking, do I help this horse to feel safe and the best version of himself? That's a big difference in those two questions. Because suddenly the relationship wasn't about what the horse was giving me. It was about what I was being able to offer to them and how I could invite a conversation with them. Am I emotionally consistent with these horses? Am I regulated? Am I clear? Am I fair? Am I seeing the horse that's right in front of me or seeing my own history reflected back at me? Or even worse, put my trauma glasses on and just interpret everything my horse is doing through the trauma that I experienced as a child. This is where I think conscious horsemanship sometimes gets misunderstood. Kindness doesn't actually mean having no expectation. And partnership doesn't mean the horse never experiences a challenge. And emotional safety doesn't mean avoiding every uncomfortable situation or setting strict boundaries if the horse is out of control. Because healthy relationships require communication, boundaries, and trust. Horses, when they're in herds, they get this naturally. They communicate with each other. They negotiate space and create boundaries with each other. And they experience pressure and release within the herd dynamic. And they continue to learn from each other constantly. So the problem is not the pressure itself. The problem is pressure without understanding fairness or emotional regulation. Our role is not to create a world where horses never experience anything difficult. In fact, if we can teach our horses to regulate themselves even in difficult situations, these horses will be the best partners in co-creation with human beings. Their life is so much easier if we teach them that. So our role really is to become the kind of humans that can guide them through experiences that are challenging with clarity and compassion and trust and regulation. Because if we need our horses to always make us feel good, always validate us, and always provide emotional comfort, we're not truly allowing them to be horses. I remember going to competitions and my horse wasn't regulated and I couldn't handle it. And so I didn't compete, and I came home and I was so disappointed that, the horse had done this and the horse had done that. And that's such a great giveaway when we talk about our horses as separate entities and we don't talk about our partnerships. So when we talk about my horse, now the horse is playing a role in your story, whereas our relationship, that now you're talking about your relationship together. And the disappointment went away when I remembered you know, my horse wasn't regulated. He wasn't right. Why am I asking him to perform in an environment where he wasn't okay or if it didn't feel safe? So by not performing and going home instead and feeling disappointed and feeling butt hurt, next time I went to a competition with this particular horse, he was actually fine because he knew he'd have an out if he wasn't okay. So our relationship grew way beyond what I could have forced him to do on the day. When we don't allow our horses to be horses, we're giving a job for them that they didn't apply for. You know, a horse can walk beside us while we heal, but they can't do our healing for us. They can never validate us enough to heal. That responsibility belongs to us. And strangely enough, when we release horses from being our therapists, our relationship with them often becomes even more beautiful because we're finally meeting them without expectation. So we stop saying, you know, please fix this broken part of me. And we start saying, I'm doing my work so that I can meet you honestly, so that I can become the rider that you deserve. And maybe that's why horses are such extraordinary teachers. Not because they rescue us from ourselves, but because they inspire us to become someone who doesn't need rescuing. They invite us into responsibility and awareness and personal integration. And when we accept that invitation, we actually become better horse people, better leaders, and more authentic versions of ourselves for our horses. So this week, I'd love you to reflect on your own relationship with your horse and gently ask yourself, you know, where might I be placing my own story onto my horse? Like, what is the role that I'm assigning for my horse according to my story? Where might I be interpreting their experience through my own wounds or fears or expectations? And what would change in our relationship if I allowed my horse to be a horse, not my therapist or rescuer or proof of my worth, but a partner who's walking alongside me while I take responsibility for my own healing? You know, if you're a student, you will have heard me. If your horse is not rideable, don't ride the horse. And this is such a great example of that you can't project on the horse, even in competitions, that you owe this to me. If your connection is shot, don't try to push through anyway. Get the connection back and then go. Thank you for being here with me today and for exploring these deeper conversations around horses and humans and the relationship between the two. Next week, we'll continue following this journey toward Brisbane 2032 and everything horses continue to teach us along the way. But until then, take care of yourself. Take care of your horse. And remember that one of the greatest gifts we can give to them is becoming responsible for ourselves. I'll see you at the next one.